February 12, 1942. A village train platform somewhere in occupied western Poland, swallowed by snow and bitter cold. A little girl named Zofia Kowalska stands barefoot on the frozen concrete, her breath coming out in small, trembling clouds. She is 7 years old. Her fingertips are white. She does not know where her mother is. She does not know where she is going. Around her, 32 other children huddle together in silence, some crying, some too numb to cry. The air smells of coal smoke and urine. A German soldier paces beside them with a rifle slung over his shoulder, his breath visible in the winter air. Somewhere behind them, in the wreckage of what used to be an orphanage, bodies are still being counted. Zofia stares at the empty railway tracks stretching into the dark forest. She does not know that in less than 48 hours she will be sold. If stories like this move you as deeply as they move me, subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. These forgotten stories deserve to live again, and your voice helps make that happen. Zofia was not a soldier. She was not a spy or a saboteur or a hero in any traditional sense. She was a child whose life had already been stolen once by war, and now it was being stolen again, this time by a system so efficient, so calculated, that it had reduced human beings to livestock, tagged and traded like cattle in a market built on blood and silence. Her story, and the stories of tens of thousands of children like her, were buried under decades of ash and shame. They were not documented in history books. They were not honored with monuments. They vanished into the black market of Nazi-occupied Europe, sold, traded, bribed away by guards who pocketed jewelry and gold and Reichsmarks in exchange for a child's life or a child's death. This is the story of the forgotten orphans who became commodities, valued at 40 Reichsmarks or less, their names erased, their faces replaced, their existence denied. Before the war came to her, Zofia Kowalska had known the quiet rhythm of a modest life. She was the daughter of a seamstress and a railway worker in a town near Łódź. Her father worked long shifts on the Polish state railways, repairing tracks and helping coordinate freight schedules. Her mother sewed dresses for local families. Zofia spent her afternoons sitting on the floor beside her mother's feet, threading needles and sorting buttons by color. She loved the smell of fresh fabric. She loved the clicking sound of the sewing machine. Her world was small, predictable, safe. In the evenings, her father would come home smelling of oil and iron, and they would sit together at the wooden table and eat potato soup by candlelight. Zofia did not know what war was. She did not know what borders meant or what politics could do to people. She only knew that she loved her mother's voice when she sang while working, and the way her father lifted her onto his shoulders to see the trains pass through the station. But in September 1939, the world broke open. German tanks rolled through Poland like thunder. Bombs fell on cities. Villages burned. Zofia's father disappeared in the chaos of the invasion. No one could say if he was conscripted, captured, or killed. Her mother tried to keep them hidden, moving from one neighbor's house to another, carrying Zofia in her arms through narrow streets filled with smoke and gunfire. For weeks, they lived in basements and attics, sleeping on cold floors, eating scraps. And then one morning in late autumn, while Zofia and her mother were hiding in an abandoned church, German soldiers swept through the building. They dragged people out into the street. They separated men from women, women from children. Zofia screamed for her mother as rough hands pulled them apart. She saw her mother's face one last time, pale, terrified, reaching, and then she was shoved into the back of a truck with dozens of other children. That was the last time Zofia ever saw her. She was 5 years old. For the next year and a half, Zofia lived in a children's home on the outskirts of a town she did not recognize. It was a drafty building with cracked windows and peeling paint, overcrowded with orphans from across the region. The caretakers were Polish women who did their best to keep the children fed and warm, but there was never enough food, never enough heat, never enough safety. The children slept in rows of thin mattresses on the floor. They whispered stories to each other in the dark, stories about their mothers, their fathers, their homes. Some of them still believed they would see their families again. Zofia stopped believing. She learned to be quiet. She learned to make herself small. She learned that crying accomplished nothing, and that the world outside the orphanage walls was a place where children like her did not matter. The moment war truly arrived for Zofia came on a cold morning in February 1942, when German soldiers surrounded the orphanage before dawn. The children were ordered to line up outside in the snow, still wearing their nightclothes. They were not told why. The caretakers tried to protest, tried to ask questions, but they were shoved aside. One of the women, an older teacher named Pani Marta, was struck across the face with the butt of a rifle when she tried to shield the youngest children. The soldiers moved through the building methodically, checking rooms, taking inventory. They carried clipboards. They carried lists. This was not random violence. This was procedure. Zofia stood in the snow with the other children, shivering, her bare feet turning numb. She did not understand what was happening. Around her, some of the younger children were crying. An older boy beside her, maybe 10 or 11, whispered that the soldiers were taking them away. To where? No one knew. A German officer in a long grey coat walked slowly along the line of children, stopping occasionally to study a face, to measure a height, to touch a child's hair. He carried a small notebook. When he stopped in front of Zofia, he tilted her chin up with his gloved hand and looked at her eyes, pale blue like her mother's. He wrote something down. Then he moved on. Zofia's heart was pounding so hard she thought she might be sick. What Zofia did not know, what none of the children knew, was that they were being evaluated, measured, categorized. This was not a roundup for labor or deportation to a camp. This was something else. This was part of a Nazi program designed to identify children who could be Germanized, children whose physical features matched the Aryan ideal that Heinrich Himmler and the SS had deemed worthy of absorption into the Third Reich. The program was called Lebensborn, and it had been expanding rapidly across occupied Poland. Tens of thousands of children were being kidnapped from their families, their orphanages, their foster homes. They were sent to selection camps where doctors and racial examiners subjected them to humiliating physical inspections, measurements of skull shape, eye color, hair texture, bone structure. Children were assigned to one of 11 racial categories based on 62 different criteria. Those deemed racially valuable were stripped of their Polish names, given German names, and placed with SS families or sent to Nazi-run institutions where they would be indoctrinated, re-educated, and eventually adopted. Those deemed of little value were sent to concentration camps or extermination centers. For the Nazis, this was not cruelty. This was policy. This was efficiency. This was the future. By mid-morning, 33 children from the orphanage, including Zofia, had been selected. They were loaded into the back of a covered truck and driven away. The caretakers stood in the snow, weeping, helpless. Zofia sat pressed against the side of the truck, staring at the faces of the other children. No one spoke. The truck drove for hours, stopping once at a checkpoint where guards inspected the cargo and waved them through. When the truck finally stopped and the back doors opened, the children were pulled out into the freezing air and herded into a large brick building. It was a transit facility, one of many scattered across occupied Poland. Inside, it was cold and dim, lit by a few bare bulbs hanging from the ceiling. The children were lined up again. This time, they were told to undress. One by one, the children were examined by German doctors and health officials. They were weighed. Their teeth were inspected, their eyes and hair were documented, some were photographed. Zofia stood naked and shivering in front of a man in a white coat who measured her head with metal calipers, wrote numbers in a ledger, and marked her file with a red stamp. She did not understand what the stamp meant, but it meant she had been approved. It meant she was racially acceptable. It meant she would not be sent to Auschwitz or Treblinka. It meant instead that she would be erased. But before Zofia and the other children could be transferred to the Lebensborn facilities, where their identities would be systematically destroyed, something else happened. Something darker. Something that the Nazi bureaucracy did not officially document, but that railway workers, local civilians, and even some low-ranking German soldiers later testified to in fragmented, horrified whispers. The children were not immediately sent onward. They were held, and during those days of waiting, they became currency. The black market in Nazi-occupied Europe was not just a place where stolen goods and rationed food changed hands. It was a shadow economy that thrived on desperation, exploitation, and human suffering. In the ghettos of Łódź and Warsaw, in the occupied zones of France and Belgium, in the transit camps and rail stations of Poland, the black market was everywhere. German soldiers bought luxury goods at artificially low prices. Civilians traded family heirlooms for bread. And in the darkest corners of this economy, human beings were bought and sold. Children were among the most vulnerable commodities. Orphans, especially, children with no parents to search for them, no documentation to prove they had ever existed, could be traded, bribed, sold to anyone willing to pay. The price varied. Sometimes it was jewelry, sometimes it was gold, sometimes it was a handful of Reichsmarks. Polish railway workers who operated the trains carrying children to transit camps later reported that German guards could be bribed. For a sum of money, sometimes as little as 40 Reichsmarks, a guard might look the other way while a child was smuggled off the train. Sometimes this was an act of rescue. A brave railway worker or a desperate relative would slip money to a guard and pull a child to safety, hiding them in a storage closet or sneaking them onto another train headed toward a safe house. But other times, it was something else. Other times, the guards themselves were selling children, not to rescuers, to buyers, to people who wanted laborers, servants, or something worse. The children who vanished this way were never counted. They were never recorded. They simply disappeared into the black market, their fates unknown. Zofia spent 3 days in that transit building, 3 days of hunger, cold, and terror. The children were given thin blankets and bowls of watery soup. They slept on the floor. Some of them were too sick to stand. At night, Zofia could hear the sound of trains passing outside, and she wondered if one of them would take her away. She wondered if her mother was still alive. She wondered if anyone in the world remembered her name. On the third night, something happened that she would never be able to fully explain, even decades later when she finally spoke about it. A man came into the room where the children were sleeping. He was not wearing a uniform. He was dressed in civilian clothes, dark coat, worn boots. He moved quietly through the rows of children, stopping occasionally to study a face. He crouched down beside Zofia and touched her shoulder. She woke with a start, her heart racing. The man put a finger to his lips. Quiet. He whispered something in Polish, words she barely understood through her fear. He told her to stand. He told her to follow him. And then, without explanation, he led her out of the building. Years later, when Zofia tried to reconstruct what happened that night, she could only remember fragments. The cold air, the darkness, the man's hand gripping hers, the sound of boots on gravel. They walked through a narrow alley between 2 buildings, past a checkpoint where a German guard stood smoking a cigarette. The man handed the guard something. Zofia could not see what. Money, maybe, or jewelry. The guard glanced at Zofia, then looked away. The man pulled her forward faster now, through the train yard, between the rusted freight cars, until they reached the far edge of the platform. There, waiting in the shadows, was a woman Zofia had never seen before. The man handed Zofia over to the woman without a word, and then he disappeared back into the darkness. The woman took Zofia's hand. She did not speak. She led her away from the station, through a gate, down a dirt road, into the night. Zofia did not know if she had been rescued or stolen. She did not know if the man and woman were heroes or criminals. She only knew that she was alive and that she was no longer in the transit building. The woman took her to a farmhouse several kilometers outside the town. It was a small, run-down place, with a sagging roof and chickens scratching in the yard. Inside there were two other children, boys, both older than Zofia, both silent and watchful. The woman did not explain who they were or where they had come from. She gave Zofia a bowl of cold porridge and a blanket. She told her to sleep. Zofia slept, and when she woke the next morning, the woman was gone. Only an older man, presumably the woman's husband, remained. He told Zofia she would work. She would help with the animals, the garden, the house. She would not go to school. She would not leave the farm. She would not speak to anyone. If soldiers came, she would hide. That was her life now. For the next 2 years, Zofia lived in that farmhouse in a strange, suspended existence. She was not treated kindly, but she was not beaten. She was fed enough to stay alive, but never enough to feel full. She worked from dawn until dark, feeding chickens, hauling water, scrubbing floors. The two boys worked in the fields. None of them spoke much. They did not know each other's real names. The old man called Zofia Marta. She did not correct him. She understood, on some instinctive level, that her survival depended on invisibility, on forgetting, on becoming no one. She did not know that across occupied Poland, hundreds of thousands of children were experiencing similar fates. Some were sent to Lebensborn homes, where their identities were systematically erased, their names Germanized, their memories suppressed through psychological conditioning and physical punishment. Some were adopted by SS families who believed they were taking in German orphans, rescued from the chaos of war. Some were sent to labor camps, some were sent to extermination camps, and some, like Zofia, simply vanished into the informal networks of the black market, traded and sold and hidden, their existence unrecorded, their fates left to chance and the whims of strangers. The Nazi bureaucracy was meticulous in many ways, but it could not track every child. It could not account for every bribe, every transaction, every moment of human greed or human compassion that diverted a child from the official channels of genocide and forced assimilation. These children fell through the cracks, and in falling, some of them survived. The historical context of what happened to Zofia and the other children is both well documented and deeply obscured. The Nazi program to kidnap and Germanize children was real, systematic, and extensive. Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, issued explicit orders beginning in 1939 for the identification and seizure of children with Aryan characteristics from occupied territories. The Lebensborn organization, originally designed to support SS families and encourage childbirth among racially pure Germans, expanded its mission to include the forced assimilation of foreign children. By 1942, the program had developed into a full-scale operation involving youth welfare offices, health departments, racial examiners from the Russia, and SS adoption networks. An estimated 200,000 to 450,000 children were kidnapped from Poland, the Soviet Union, Yugoslavia, and other occupied regions. Many were taken from orphanages, which were seen as easy targets. Children with no parents to search for them, no legal guardians to protest. Others were taken from foster families, from villages, from the streets. The process was bureaucratic and brutal. Children were stripped, measured, examined, and categorized. Those who passed the racial examinations were sent to re-education camps, where they were beaten for speaking their native languages, forced to learn German, and told that their parents were dead. Younger children adapted more quickly. Older children resisted, and many of them were sent to concentration camps or youth labor camps as punishment. But alongside this official program, a shadow economy operated. The chaos of war created opportunities for corruption, exploitation, and profit. German soldiers and guards stationed at transit camps and train stations often had access to valuables confiscated from Jewish families and Polish civilians. They also had access to children. Testimonies from Polish railway workers after the war describe how guards could be bribed with gold, jewelry, or cash to allow children to be taken off deportation trains. Some of these bribes were acts of rescue, families paying to save a child, resistance networks smuggling children to safety. But other transactions were darker. Children were sold to farmers who needed laborers. They were sold to households that wanted servants. They were sold to individuals whose intentions remain unknown. The price for a child varied depending on the circumstances, the location, and the desperation of the parties involved. In some documented cases, the price was as low as a few dozen Reichsmarks, the cost of a meal, a pack of cigarettes, a night's entertainment for a German soldier. These transactions were not recorded in official documents. They left no paper trail. The children involved had no voice, no advocates, no means of reporting what had happened to them. Many of them died during the war. Many who survived had no memory of their origins, and many were simply forgotten. In the spring of 1944, as the Soviet army began its advance westward and the Nazi occupation of Poland started to crumble, the old man who had kept Zofia on his farm grew increasingly anxious. He stopped sending her out to the garden. He kept her inside, hidden in a back room. He told her that soldiers were coming, Russian soldiers, and that she needed to stay silent. Zofia was 9 years old now. She had grown taller, thinner, harder. She had learned to read the old man's moods, to sense danger before it arrived. She knew that something was ending. One morning in early summer, the old man loaded a cart with what few possessions he had and told Zofia and the two boys to get in. They traveled for 2 days, moving west, away from the front lines, through roads clogged with refugees and retreating German troops. They slept in ditches. They ate nothing. And then, in a small town near the German border, the old man abandoned them. He simply walked away while they were sleeping, taking the cart and the horse, leaving the 3 children alone in a bombed-out village square. Zofia did not cry. She did not panic. She had learned by then that survival required silence and patience. She and the 2 boys wandered through the ruined town until they found a group of Polish refugees camped in the shell of a church. The refugees took them in, gave them food, asked them who they were. Zofia did not know how to answer. She did not remember her last name. She did not remember the name of the town where she had been born. She told them her name was Marta, because that was the name the old man had used. One of the boys said his name was Jan. The other boy said nothing at all. The refugees brought them to a makeshift orphanage that had been set up by a Catholic relief organization in the basement of a school. There were dozens of children there, orphans, runaways, children separated from their families in the chaos of war. No one asked too many questions. No one had answers. Zofia lived in that orphanage for 6 months. In January 1945, Soviet forces liberated the area, and the children were transferred to a larger facility run by the new Polish provisional government. Aid workers came through, trying to reunite children with surviving relatives, but for most of the children, there was no one to find. Families had been destroyed, records had been burned, villages had been erased. Zofia sat through dozens of interviews where well-meaning social workers asked her questions she could not answer. "Where are you from?" "I don't know." "What is your mother's name?" "I don't remember." "Do you have any family?" "I don't think so." Eventually, the questions stopped. She was assigned a new name, Zofia Nowak, a placeholder identity for a girl with no past, and placed in a state-run children's home in Krakow. She was 10 years old. She did not speak about the farmhouse, or the transit camp, or the man who had led her away in the dark. She did not speak about the orphanage where she had been stolen, or the mother whose face she could no longer clearly remember. She learned to be quiet. She learned to forget. For the next 40 years, Zofia Nowak lived an unremarkable life. She finished school. She worked in a textile factory. She married a man she met at a dance hall. She had 2 children. She grew old. She did not talk about the war. When her children asked her about her childhood, she told them she did not remember much. It was easier that way. Easier than trying to explain something she herself did not fully understand. Easier than confronting the gaps in her memory, the nightmares that still woke her in the middle of the night, the feeling she had carried her entire life that she was not who she was supposed to be. It was not until 1985, when a German historian named Dr. Klaus Müller began investigating the Lebensborn program and its associated crimes, that fragments of Sophia's story began to resurface. Müller had spent years combing through archives in Germany, Poland, and the Soviet Union, searching for records of kidnapped children. He found railway manifests, transit camp logs, medical examination files, adoption records. He found names, thousands of names of children who had been processed through the Nazi system. And buried in a stack of documents from a transit facility in western Poland, he found a partial list dated February 1942. 33 children. Most of the names had been crossed out, replaced with German equivalents. But one name had been left partially visible beneath the ink: Zofia Kowalska, age 7. Beside the name was a notation: transferred, pending placement. But there was no follow-up record, no adoption file, no further documentation. Zofia Kowalska had simply disappeared from the official record. Müller began searching for survivors. He placed notices in Polish newspapers. He contacted orphanages, churches, veteran organizations. And in 1987, he received a letter from an elderly woman living in Krakow. Her name was Zofia Nowak. She had read the notice. She thought she might be one of the children he was looking for. Müller traveled to Poland to meet her. He brought the documents, the transit list, the medical examination notes, the faded photographs of children standing in snow. Zofia stared at the photograph for a long time. She did not recognize herself, but she recognized the coat one of the children was wearing, a grey wool coat with a torn pocket. She remembered that coat. She remembered the cold. She remembered the man in the dark. Müller asked her what she remembered. She told him everything she could: the fragments, the gaps, the farmhouse, the silence. Müller's research and the testimonies of survivors like Zofia eventually contributed to a broader understanding of the crimes committed against children during the Nazi occupation. In the decades following the war, tens of thousands of stolen children had tried to reconstruct their identities, searching for their birth families, their real names, their origins. Some succeeded, most did not. The psychological damage was immense. Many of the children who had been forcibly Germanized grew up believing they were German, only to discover in adulthood that their entire identity had been a lie. Some rejected their Polish heritage, unable to reconcile the trauma. Others spent their lives searching for answers that no longer existed. The Nazi program to erase these children had been devastatingly effective, and the black market transactions, the bribes, the sales, the informal trades, had left even fewer traces. Children like Zofia, who had been diverted from the official channels, existed in a kind of documentary void. They had been stolen twice, once from their families and again from history. In 2001, the French government held a trial in absentia for Alois Brunner, one of the SS officers responsible for organizing the deportations of children from occupied territories. Brunner had personally overseen the arrest and deportation of hundreds of Jewish and Polish children, including 345 orphans from the Paris region. He had been directly involved in the implementation of Himmler's child abduction directives. The trial was largely symbolic. Brunner had fled to Syria after the war and was believed to be dead, but it served as an official acknowledgement of crimes that had been ignored for too long. The testimony presented at the trial included accounts from survivors, railway workers, and resistance members who described the conditions under which children were transported, the bribes paid to guards, the sales conducted at train stations and transit camps. The evidence was fragmentary, but it was undeniable. Children had been commodities. They had been bought and sold. And the price, in some cases, had been as low as 40 Reichsmarks. Zofia Nowak died in 1993, 6 years after her meeting with Dr. Müller. She never found her mother. She never learned what had happened to the other children from the orphanage. She never discovered who the man in the dark had been, or why he had taken her, or what he had paid. But she had told her story. She had spoken the fragments aloud, and in doing so, she had reclaimed something that the Nazis had tried to take from her: her voice, her name, her right to be remembered. Her testimony became part of the historical record, a small piece of evidence in the larger documentation of crimes against children. It was not enough to bring justice. It was not enough to repair the damage. But it was something. The story of the orphans sold on the Nazi black market is not a story of heroes or villains in the traditional sense. It is a story about systems, systems of violence, systems of exploitation, systems of silence. It is a story about how war reduces human beings to objects, how bureaucracy can facilitate genocide, and how the most vulnerable, children, orphans, the forgotten, are always the first to be sacrificed. But it is also a story about survival, about the small, stubborn acts of endurance that allow people to outlast the machinery of destruction, about the railway workers who risk their lives to feed imprisoned children, about the caretakers who tried to shield their charges even when it was hopeless, about the survivors who lived long enough to tell their stories, even when the world did not want to listen. Today, the archives are fuller, the testimonies are documented, the names are being recovered. Organizations in Germany, Poland, and other countries are working to identify stolen children, to locate their descendants, to piece together family histories that were deliberately destroyed. It is slow, difficult work. Many of the records are incomplete. Many of the survivors are dead. But the work continues because the stories matter. Because the children who were sold for 40 Reichsmarks, who were erased from official documents, who were traded like livestock in the shadow economy of Nazi-occupied Europe, deserve to be remembered. Not as statistics, not as victims, but as human beings who existed, who suffered, who endured, who had names, who had mothers, who had lives. When we think about the Holocaust, we often think about the camps, Auschwitz, Treblinka, Bergen-Belsen. We think about the gas chambers, the mass graves, the 6 million dead. And we should. But we must also think about the other crimes, the crimes that were committed in transit camps and train stations. The crimes that were conducted in broad daylight by ordinary people who saw opportunity in suffering. The crimes that left no bodies, no witnesses, no evidence. The children who were sold. The children who were stolen. The children who disappeared. They were not soldiers. They were not resistance fighters. They were children, and their stories are part of the war, too. Zofia Kowalska, or Zofia Nowak, or Marta, or whatever name she carried in the years between, was one of them. She was 7 years old when she was taken. She was 10 years old when the war ended. She was 71 when she finally spoke. And now, decades after her death, her story lives again. Not because it is unique, but because it is not. Because there were tens of thousands of children like her. Children with no weapons, no rank, no protection. Children whose extraordinary courage was simply surviving, simply remembering, simply refusing to disappear completely. In the end, history is not just made by generals and politicians. It is made by seamstresses and railway workers and 7-year-old girls standing barefoot in the snow. It's made by the people who are never named in the textbooks, who leave no monuments, who vanish into the margins. But they were there. They lived. They mattered. And their stories, however fragmented, however painful, however incomplete, are the stories we must tell. Because if we do not, then the silence wins, and the children who were sold for 40 Reichsmarks will be forgotten again. And that is a crime we can still prevent.